So the model of the developmental immaturity, let's have a look at it. And this is my chance to probably unashamedly, just passionately describe this model. It has become the map of my recovery. So if we bring this model always started with a basic hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that the nature of a child has some fairly simple components, very important components, but that these things need to be met for a child to grow up to have certain characteristics, attitudes and beliefs that allow them to live comfortably within themselves, centered inside themselves with certain abilities to function. Firstly, the nature of a child is that they're valuable, inherently worthwhile, and that this isn't something we give lip service to. This is the experience that a child will have in a family system where a parent is absolutely drawn to the birth of a child, the presence of a child right from those first moments. I took some wonderful pictures in the hospital. In the day and age where we share share everything on the social media, I haven't yet. I've kept these pictures of my wife when she first sat with a baby Harland, our last child, and just the natural present gaze that took place. Organic. When a functioning adult human being is in their body and present, their upper vagal social engagement system is drawn to, hardwired to connect, especially with all those endorphins going through the body from the birth experience. So children are naturally valuable, and over time those value that needs get more sophisticated, but more exciting as a parent. It's one of those wonderful experiences where you get to just engage, and that energy starts to come back towards you as they're engaging and sharing themselves. So children are inherently valuable, and over 0 to 18, that value and the way you engage to increase that value, certainly it becomes different, but it's a wonderful experience. Certainly as a dad, it's one of the easiest things to find, to value those boys when they bring themselves to me. Children inherently vulnerable. There's right from the special needs of a newborn is very vulnerable. Even the way that a house is set up, fragrances, things that we know now from the medical professional, what to be careful around sudden infant death syndrome, and to the health needs of a child, and that vulnerability over their 0 to 18 period is sophisticated. It gets parents reading. I know my wife has read all the early childhood books. I read books around how to be and how to support that vulnerability. I couldn't personally rely on my own history, because it was a very unsafe place. I grew up with mental illness. So children are inherently vulnerable physically, intellectually, emotionally and behaviourally, and need age-appropriate boundaries set by parents, set on the child and set around the child. So adult to adult, adult to other siblings, siblings to siblings. Very important that that vulnerability is protected within the family system and stewarded by the adults outside of the family system. A lot of the clients I see these days around bullying, families that didn't know how to engage or stand up against a school system to support the needs of a child due to their own shame or inability to set boundaries, that weren't able to protect protect children. So that vulnerability needing and absolutely needing to be protected. Now, children around there are perfectly imperfect, that all human beings are perfectly imperfect. And I think the message in this, I was asked about this in module training this week by staff, the idea is that around our reality, our body, our thoughts, our feelings and our behaviour, they're all expressions of our perfect imperfection. We will be self-centered, self-focused, and children in particular are self-centered beings. They start as the center of the universe and hopefully end up as a very important part in it, but not the center of it. And so this perfect imperfection just means age appropriately we're going to have physical limitations, cognitive limitations, emotional limitations and behavioural limitations, and at times we're going to impact and injure ourselves and others. We're going to do things at times to hurt other people, even on purpose because we're angry and mad, and then have to go back and make amends. In the parenting process, parents are imperfect, and I think one of the best gifts you can give your child is repair, transparency, going back and promptly admitting it when we make a mistake or we err, and letting them know what happened, age appropriately of course, so they can see that it's actually okay to make mistakes. And in my own recovery, I was really overwhelmed by the first time I ever heard and saw John Bradshaw's work, especially Healing the Shame That Binded You, because I grew up in an incredibly toxic, shaming environment, and to now in my own parenting, really have that goal to have a non-shaming environment. If someone makes a mistake or breaks something or ruins something, I remember my wife ringing me and saying, "Young Maverick, he's our well, if you call a child Maverick, you sort of got it coming. But he had broken our TV set with a drumstick. He was 2 years old. It must have been a great hit. And I remember thinking, well, if I'm going to give a child drumsticks and have a big screen TV within reach, I've nearly got it coming. And I remember an episode in my childhood when me and my sister were throwing things around the living room, and a marble hit the TV screen, and we both knew we were in awful trouble. And but back in our family system, we were incredibly shamed for that, and yet it was sort of age appropriate play, and the parents weren't present. There was no boundaries being set. And so it just, I'm really glad that I'm being able to learn those lessons of my own dysfunctional childhood and hopefully pass on. I don't get it right. I certainly don't want to set it up and say I get it right all the time. Some of the powerful moments with my children are when I've had to own my own imperfection. Children are dependent. They're absolutely dependent. In a newborn is an absolute ornament when it comes to meeting their own needs. They need us completely to be very sensitive, to know what cry is for what need. And I'm always in awe of that beautiful bond that mums, as I watch my wife connect with the babies. It's just beauty in motion, and to look at those dependency needs. And then as they get older, children's needs get more sophisticated as they get more sophisticated. And I've liked Pia's her little parenting bumper sticker, which is to do for, help do, and then stand back and support. And so it's meeting those dependency needs around not just food, water, shelter, because plenty of people come into therapy and treatment saying, well, I had a roof over my head and I was fed and I was looked after and sent to school, but also those intellectual, emotional, spiritual, sexual needs, where we need age-appropriate information and medical, dental, etc. These things aren't, as Pia Mellody says, they're not nice to haves. These are needs. They have to have. Wants are nice to have, but these are where we are non-negotiables that we need to have. Now, if a child is being valued age appropriately, their vulnerability is being protected age appropriately, if they're perfect imperfection and they're learning about their reality age appropriately and their dependency needs are met, then essentially a child is free to be in the moment. Their nature is to be spontaneous, alive, creative, and beautifully in the moment. John Bradshaw quotes a poem, and I put it up on social media occasionally, by Thomas Marley, which is around the beauty of a child. And one of the lines in it is, there was a time, oh tender elf, when you were poetry itself. And when children are in a very safe environment, they can be open and spontaneous. There's nothing more beautiful than just watching that glorious openness of that innocence. So children need healthy parenting to develop and maintain these attitudes and beliefs. That's the hypothesis. That this is what's needed. As the interpersonal neurobiologists are sort of really flooding the psychological marketplace these days with wonderful literature and research and science, I remember when I first started lecturing on it, people would have different opinions about, sort of nature and nurture, but it seems to be fairly well accepted now that these things are fairly essential. Now, what they lead to is if you're valued age appropriately over time, you get the ability to self-esteem. You have a sense of inherent worth. I mentioned recently in the self-esteem webinar that Professor Show from Harvard talks about, and it was a wonderful example. He said people that grow up with being valued age appropriately, they sort of get up in the morning and have an internal sense that life's going to work out for them. Even if it's a bad day, even if they miss the bus, their umbrella breaks in the rain, they get a flat tire, the car breaks down, the car gets stolen, they're going to have feelings about it, but they have an inherent sort of compass. They've got a true north. They really have a sense that life will work out for them. So this ability to have that self-valuing aspect as a core principle that doesn't get buffeted too much by the external elements. That vulnerability protected and experienced in a family system then leads to personal boundaries, internal, external and sexual boundaries that allow us to protect and contain our reality. The imperfection, when we know and get taught about our reality and get those reality needs met in the next one, people learn and have a sort of between their body, thoughts, feelings, behavior, connected to themselves, are quite centered inside themselves, and they're able to, from that centeredness, get the data they need around their dependency needs, where they can be interdependent with others. And generally, if you're self-valuing, got good boundaries, know your reality and can meet your needs, life will exist with a fair amount of moderation. Now, that hypothesis is what then people can go on and live fairly healthy lives. And it's usually my argument when people say, well, doesn't that make everybody codependent if these symptoms are certain, isn't everyone traumatized? And I don't think so. I think there is people in the world that have the ability to self-esteem, have boundaries, know their reality, meet their dependency needs and live in a fair amount of moderation. They do exist. And so I don't think everyone's been traumatized or everyone's ends up with these certain symptoms I'm just about to go over. Life happens to people and painful moments can happen, but if you've got resilience and you've got these basic building blocks, they can be traversed and we can make our way through and not necessarily keep re-traumatizing ourselves. When children experience, now the bottom blue corner, when children experience a lack of nurturing, trauma and abuse and neglect, it can cause developmental immaturity. Now this is an interesting claim because it's saying that it actually causes it. So we're saying it's got a causational effect, and I think what's been really awesome for people with developmental trauma is watching the new information come through from these sort of interpersonal neurobiologists that are really bringing all the attachment work from the 60s and 70s forward and saying, look, this is what we can see happens now, not just in the big picture, but the work of Dr. Ed Tronick or Dr. Alan Shaw, where they drill down and go, wow, in that first 12 months when the brain is really only in that reptilian sort of nervous system stage, this is what happens with this sort of trauma and abuse. This is what happens in that next year, the year after that. We start to really see the complex impact on the brain that this trauma has. And so it's really helped me understand, and certainly when I'm helping people that are coming for support around these issues, help them understand that you can't outrun this. You couldn't just pull your socks up over this. This is something where we've been really fundamentally impacted by it, and we would absolutely need to do something to address this injury. It doesn't just go away on its own. And that can sort of be a relief for folks. I remember it was an enormous relief when I went to Narcotics Anonymous and they said that you're not a bad person trying to be good, you're a sick person trying to get well. And I've got a quote of Gabor Mate's coming up shortly, and I think in our in modern day treatment and healing and dealing with these sorts of symptoms, it's more accepted now that that's actually the case. It wasn't always accepted that that wasn't the case. So Pia says when that lack of nurturing, trauma, stress parenting, etc., interrupts this process of what children's need, then some certain predictable things happen in regards to treatment. Now, when we first started sharing this model, we were quite experiential in nature. Many psychiatrists and therapists would come through and say, look, what's the research that you have that's supporting this sort of model, really? You know, to be best practice, you've got to have research. And I think what's come out recently, in the last sort of 10 years, is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and the therapists that were on the committee that were presenting to the DSM-5 were putting forward the idea of these symptoms from developmental trauma unique enough to have their own particular diagnoses. They suggested developmental trauma disorder. It didn't get through, but they certainly were relying on the adverse childhood experience study, and I've pulled one of the slides from that study here to show that when they actually measured a cohort of about, I think it was about 17,500 people from the Department of Disease in America, they actually got quite incredible data that showed that it was in regards to mental health, sexual health, drug and alcohol, and physical illness. It's certainly part of our disease. People have come to South Pacific and the Meadows to deal with the physical illness as a result of stress, as a result of developmental trauma, and mental health conditions, senses of self around hopelessness, etc. We've seen now they've got hardcore evidence, the biggest amount of research and evidence ever, that of the impact and the percentage of people that were impacted from adverse childhood experience. I won't go too much into the other information on this slide. I really just wanted to refer to that fact that there's this information now that's really supporting out there, research-driven information that supports this model. Dr. Alan Shaw, somebody who is presenting in Melbourne down at the Australian Childhood Foundation's Trauma Conference 2016. The 2014 conference was the best conference I've ever been to. We had Dr. Ed Tronick, Pat Ogden, Alan Shaw, Dan Siegel, all in attendance. Dr. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory. Now, when Alan Shaw, like P.M. Mellody, started writing about this model, it was experiential. It was an idea. Now it's science. Now it's research-driven. They've got the data. And he says that attachment theory is deceptively simple on the surface. And I'm just going to get something out of the slide so you can see the whole slide here. That it posits that real relationships in the early stages of life indelibly shape our survival functions in basic ways, and that for the rest of the lifespan, attachment processes lie at the center of the human experience. How effective attachment communications facilitate the maturation of brain systems involved in affect and self-regulation. When our therapists would say there's this amazing correlation between developmental trauma and addictions, and we believe that it's driving, this developmental trauma is driving addictions, you know, the talents of Alan Shaw and the research over many years has come along and sort of really honed it down to, yes, absolutely, the way the brain soothes and regulates itself absolutely is impacted by those early childhood experiences. Dr. Peter Levine, the somatic expression therapist, talks about when that trauma, if we've experienced that trauma, it's not an historical exercise. People come into South Pacific and go into the Changes program and say, look, I didn't come here to talk about that stuff that happened way back then. And he just makes the point that it's not a historical issue. We're dealing with something that's actually active in our nervous system today. And a quote here I've picked from his book, Waking the Tiger, is traumatic symptoms are not caused by the triggering event itself. So it's not caused by the stuff that's actually just happened in front of you. The veteran that is, say, at the New Year's Eve fireworks and there's a big explosion and now they're hidden, they're underneath the table as a physical reaction. They stem from the frozen residue of energy that had not been resolved or discharged. This residue remains trapped in the nervous system where it can wreak havoc in our bodies and spirits. And for anyone that's lived with someone with complex post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, it wreaks havoc on families, friends, relationships, and communities. So the idea that what we're dealing with is something that's in the nervous system now, right here, right now. It's not historical. Always made sense to me, because when I worked in the Changes process and really supporting people to release that trauma, it was happening in front of me live. We weren't talking about an historical event, and it certainly wasn't caused by the trigger. So where does that fall into the model? what Pia started to observe when she first put this model together, that there was around self-esteem, boundaries, reality, dependency and moderation issues, an observable phenomenon that happened. And it's the beginning of some of the jargon in this model. Firstly, she is the wounded child. And she said that when she talks about this on the Mapping Your Recovery, she said that this isn't the disease, this is the evidence of the immaturity. The disease is the secondary symptoms. So she said that around self-esteem, when you're around that developmental trauma, because we're self-centered and self-focused, a child will feel less than. Even if the abuse is happening outside, an adult to adult or adult to another sibling, a child, because they cannot filter and set a boundary, will feel less than about themselves. If their vulnerability is not protected, there's no boundaries, they're not kept safe, either from covert or overt trauma, a child will feel too vulnerable. If, in regards to their reality, a child is shamed personally and deliberately, or around shameless behaviour, if they're shamed deliberately, they will have induced shame and toxic shame, as John Bradshaw says. If they're around others acting shamelessly, they will have what we call carried shame. This toxic level of shame leaves someone feeling bad and flawed, and we can see it get acted out in a rebelliousness, but the rebellion is very immature in the observation. It will look and sound young. Dependency issues, when our dependency needs were not met, that a child will feel too dependent, will feel too needy, to use a more simple word. And if you feel less than, too vulnerable, bad and flawed and too dependent, that experience itself is out of control. And generally when we fall to that wounded child, it'll reflect the way we felt, the felt sense. Now the interpersonal neurobiologists have come along and talked about that pre-7 sort of traumatic experience, and in that trauma experience we can't remember times and dates, and it's generally stored in what they call our implicit memory, the felt sense. So Pia Mellody was way ahead of her time when she was framing this up and saying, look, you're not going to have insight, you're not necessarily going to remember the event, but every so often you're going to have what Pete Walker calls an emotional flashback, just bursts into you, and it's overwhelming because this stuff can happen anywhere, because it can get triggered by a scent or a smell or a look or a particular behavior, sometimes very subtle, the roll of an eye, the squint of a brow, and all of a sudden, boom, we're in an emotional flashback. So it's going to feel out of control, and it'll feel childlike, hence the idea of wounded child. Now, Pia says that that's an abhorrent place to be. People generally want to escape that. And when you grow up in a family system, you see people escaping that. So she said that we will adapt. We will start to develop adaptions to survive. It's our survival instinct. Around our self-esteem, our sense of value, we'll start to act better than. Now, for some of us that were overindulged as a child, that we might act grandiose and arrogant and better than others. We can also just try and act better than how we actually feel about ourselves. So if I feel really low about myself, like I'm really worthless, I might try to appear as though that's not the case. So we feel less than, we act better than. When we feel too vulnerable, that vulnerability being overwhelming, to feel that unsafe, we'll learn ways from observing the family to act invulnerable. Now, depending on where we've come from, that invulnerability can look really differently. Some people act invulnerable through walls of pleasantness, walls of niceness, walls of silence, walls of avoidance. And other people act invulnerable with walls of rage, violence, threat, power, and so it can be very, 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 very different. And so we can never, I suppose the take-home message there is that raging, crazy, long-haired, tattooed, violent person can be creating the same intimacy difficulties as somebody who is absolutely disconnected through a wall of caretaking. I'm not saying that the impact of their behavior will be the same, but the disconnection it's the same goal. When we're bad and flawed around those reality issues, it's nearly abhorrent to feel that way, to feel that toxic shame. So we'll learn ways in the family to act good and perfect. And anyone that's heard me lecture on this before, I always slide that rebellious word over. With those second child scapegoats, we can absolutely act rebellious, but it's not going to sound small and little. We'll act like nothing matters. It doesn't matter. Did you just get out of prison? Yeah, did your car get something? Yeah, no, I didn't like that car anyway. We'll act as if. We won't sound small or little. It'll be a bit grandiose, but we will act like we don't care. If you don't try, you can't fail. So good and perfect and that sort of rebellion. Where we felt too needy and too dependent, we'll act anti-dependent, and again, based on the family, based on what we've observed by the major stakeholders, parents, caregivers, we will replicate some of those behaviours or replicate it in a way where we do the direct opposite. So we'll act anti-dependent based on what we've seen in the family system. If you are acting better than, invulnerable, good and perfect, and anti-dependent, essentially we're trying to be in control. Now Pia says that reflects the way that we were parented during problematic childhood experiences. And she describes this as two extremes in our personality, that we actually pendulum between this less than to better than, too vulnerable to invulnerable, bad and flawed to good and perfect, too needy to needless and wantless, out of control to in control. And that is an incredibly stressful way to walk through any minute, any hour, any day, any decade, a lifetime. This is what they were saying in the Adverse Childhood Experience study about ill health, early death, all sorts of stress and anxiety. John Bradshaw made the point that if this has been your experience, you have to have low-level anxiety. There's no way you can live in those two extremes and not have a melancholic mood at times, or a melancholy mania, or at least low-level anxiety. It's a stressful way to live. As a result of this, generally we start to see symptoms develop as a result. Now, we don't need to wait to 18 for these symptoms to develop. We can see these things in childhood start developing. I won't go into it too much here because I talked about it in the last webinar on complex stress. But the different diagnoses that children get, we're in a period where we have the most over-medicated adolescent population on the planet of all time at the moment. What we are creating is a whole generation of people that will not learn to regulate their state in a non-medicated way. This isn't a spiel anti-medication. It's just stating that a pharmacological intervention in adolescence on its own will leave a child without the benefits of learning how to change their state. In the Mindful Therapist and the books that Dan Siegel has written on parenting, parenting from the inside out, he gives plenty of examples of working with adolescents with mindfulness, meditation, focused awareness to start to change their state, to actually give the brain an optimum opportunity of sort of changing the neural pathways, changing the synaptic firing patterns of the old ones. It hasn't got that quick fix that sometimes the pharmacotherapy approach has, but working in tandem or even in and of itself, he's certainly got parents' recommendations or permission at times to work with an adolescent that's not in harm of major self-harm, to work to a resolution that's non-medicated. And I think that is a really exciting breakthrough. So we have secondary symptoms that will be as a result of these two extremes in our personality. Now these are put together, and I'm going to separate them in a second, but I'll say them put together. We'll see symptoms of depression, dishonesty, rage issues, enmeshment, control, physical illness, intimacy issues, eating disorders, money disorders, anxiety disorders, spirituality issues, process addictions, chemical addictions, love and avoidance addiction, and problems with interdependence. So within that collection, these things start to emerge, not just at 18. We can see children in therapy for depression, for addiction issues. I've had people come through treatment that have started self-sexing from 6 and onwards, and men and women. This isn't a gender issue. So we've learned to reach out and start to medicate self-harm at the earliest of ages. Alcoholism starting in the teens. What we know now is pornography use is between 8 and 12. years old. The research we have on it is frightening. So we know that people start to reach out, and these secondary symptoms start to develop way before people reach adult age. Now, at the top there, it talks about secondary symptoms and relational issues, and I want to sort of just separate that for a second, because this model and the power of the model and the map has probably a clearer way of looking at it. But I just want to mention this because, as I said, Gabor Mate makes that point that people with addiction issues, if we just deal with the secondary symptom alone, we're completely missing the point. He says that hardcore drug addicts that I treat are, without exception, people who have extraordinarily difficult lives. The commonality is childhood abuse. These people all enter life under extremely adverse circumstances. Not only did they not get what they need for healthy development, they actually got negative circumstances of neglect. That's the point there. Pia mentions that too. She says that we need to grieve what we got and grieve what we didn't get when it comes to our recovery work. And that's what sets up the brain biology in addiction. In other words, the addiction is related both psychologically, in terms of emotional pain relief, and neurobiological development to early adversity. His book, new book at the moment, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, a beautiful book. His presence on YouTube is amazing. If you get a chance, please just type in Gabor Mate into YouTube. He's a wonderful advocate for a deep recovery. Now, I mentioned in the model the symptoms of trauma in action. So if we look at the secondary symptoms in this more separated format, you'll start to see what this map can really do for you in your recovery. So Pia says in regards to self-esteem, we can have the wounded child experience a less than, the adult adapted child experience a better than. But in regards to secondary symptoms, what it means is in regards to my self-esteem, I will have negative control issues in regards to others. I will not feel really clear and valued and inherently valuable inside myself. So the way I am will be I'll need to either control others or allow them to control me, so I can get that sense of value. In regards to having damaged boundaries, if I feel too vulnerable and act invulnerable, I will simply have an inability to protect and contain and filter myself. So I'm going to have resentment and rage. Now, resentment from the old French language to mean to re-feel, it will simply mean that I am going to have an inability to process emotion and release it and resolve it. So I'm going to collect and hang on to and grow a sense of feeling. Now, if I've come from a childhood family system where I've already got a whole lot of toxic levels of feeling, then emotionally I'm going to be overwhelmed. And that's where the rage comes in, the acting out of that unprocessed feeling with thoughts of powerlessness and negative sort of core beliefs. That becomes a perfect storm, and we can rage out or rage in. Spirituality issues, if I feel fundamentally at my core bad and flawed, and I desperately try to act good and perfect to cover it up, or have that underlying childhood tantrum rebellion, or that act like it doesn't matter rebellion, I'm in spiritual crisis. Meaning that inside my reality and how I experience myself and express myself, I am unable to do that with any major comfort. In regards to my dependency, being too needy and acting needless and wantless, the inability to adequately and functionally meet my needs will start to see the emergence of reaching outside of me to change my state, that affect regulatory relationship with all addictions, process and chemical. That I will definitely start to have a neurobiological sort of brain chemistry malfunction around the ability to soothe self, and so I'll start to see the symptoms of depression or anxiety. And I will, under that level of stress and adding those addictions and depression and anxiety symptoms, my body will start to give way. Irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, heart, lungs, organ problems. We will definitely start to see either physical illness as a result of just the childhood trauma untreated alone, or physical illness connected to the mental health and addiction issues untreated. If I have an inability to moderate and be spontaneous and open in the moment, life will feel out of control. The wounded child, I'll feel over-controlling in the adult adapted child, and that will absolutely mean that in regards to intimacy, I'm going to have difficulty identifying and reading the data I need in my own reality from my body, my thoughts, my feelings, and my behavior. And so what happens then is that those things then have a relational component. That if that's what's happening inside of me, the wounded adult adapted child to extremes, and then these secondary symptoms, growing momentum every day I keep functioning from it, the more momentum they grow, then relationally I'm in real trouble. My self-esteem will get played out relationally by relational self-esteem issues. I'll either put myself in the one up, I'm better than you, or one down, less than, and within a conversation with a codependent, that can bounce around like either like a yo-yo or be as quick as a squash ball. We can go to and fro, better than, less than, better than. If I've got resentment and rage as a result of my primary symptoms in regards to boundaries, then I'm either going to feel too enmeshed with someone, locked in and sort of trapped in reaction to who they are. I'm afraid of to share what I think and feel because of what you might think and feel about how I think and feel, that enmeshment, or we have to be in avoidance. We either get enmeshed or we avoid. I've written the word abandonment there, which is a typo. I'll fix that for the YouTube slide. It's enmeshment or avoidance. If I'm in spiritual crisis around my reality, fundamentally in relationship, I'm just going to be dishonest. Now, some folks who have got really active addiction issues, especially with sex addiction, we can have incredible compartmentalizing. I mentioned sex addiction because if someone's got alcoholism, if they get drunk, they'll usually get caught. They can lie about it, but we can breathalyze them, we can smell it, we'll see it. But with some of our process addictions, gambling, sex, etc., we will be fundamentally can have incredible skills. Now, Dr. Patrick Carnes mentions that if you came from a rigid family system where you didn't get those needs met, mentioned in the model, then essentially I will and others will learn how to live a compartmentalized life. We'll learn to bury what's really going on and just present to people what we want them to see. Lots of folk come into South Pacific and treatment centres that have sort of said, look, I've never told anyone the real story, and slowly but surely that can emerge once trust is built. If I'm anti-dependent as a reaction of being too dependent, I've got the addiction, mental health and physical health issues, I'm going to have incredible trouble in relationship. There's absolutely no way you can have comorbid depression, alcoholism and cigarette nicotine addiction and that be increasing in its powerlessness, increasing in its unmanageability and consequences, and then you go home and play happy families. It's not going to happen. Every relationship's going to be under stress. With all of the above, everything I've just mentioned, and that inability at a spontaneous, open, sort of moderate, out of control, in control, not able to be inside your own skin, and then be intimate with others with any great depth, I'm going to have a lot of intensity issues. We're basically going to be, when it comes to relationship, quite intense. Pia said around this model that she uses it as a map, and I described this yesterday just as an example. I've had clients come in that spiritual crisis saying, listen, I'm really overwhelmed, I don't know where I'm at, but I had this fight yesterday with a boss at work, and then we'll go like, well, let's just start there. What happened? We'll do a bit of a reality around it. Well, the boss did X, and then what happened then is, well, I got resentful, and I just sort of hid in the lunchroom, and then went home sick halfway through the day, and I thought of going back later on that night and just sort of spray painting his car, but I didn't do it. And my wife asked me what was going on. I just didn't want to tell her, so I just lied, said I had a stomach ache and went to bed early. But before I went to bed, I'd sort of made sure I snuck a few sort of extra drinks. But anyway, I don't really know what's going on. And if you just bring this map out and go, well, that's interesting. It sounds like at work you were confronted and you went into a lot of resentment and fantasies of rage, but a lot of that rage was sort of fantasized about outwards and went inwards. You really disconnected from the boss first, your wife next. I went into dishonesty about that because of your overwhelm, started to use the alcohol as a way to medicate how you feel, and all of a sudden this thing starts to open up with what the issue is. The last column, the functional adult column, is the solution. And I want to get to that in a second. At the bottom there, you'll see it says that the functional adult, through treatment, recovery, intimacy, and reparenting, supports the development of this functional sense of self. And it's the last bit of our jargon, really. The functional adult, wounded child, adult adapted child becomes the triangle of reparenting that's so essential to treatment. Just dealing with your secondary symptoms alone will not equal recovery. So we know, like I said in that earlier part of the presentation, that just dealing with the secondary symptoms might relieve some immediate stress, but it absolutely will not lead to a sense of well-being and wholeness. So Pia makes the point that in that, look, it's time to turn up, grow up, and face our reality, meaning that I am now responsible for the two recoveries. The first one is to develop this functional adult. So learning to esteem from within. Very difficult, because to esteem from within, I've got to do that shame reduction work. To learn to both contain, learn to both contain my reality and protect my reality. To have internal, external, and sexual boundaries can be an incredibly difficult thing to do, and I'll talk a bit about that in a sec. To accept the imperfection of myself and others, to get in touch with my reality in all its imperfect glory, to take a risk and share that with appropriate people can be a really difficult thing to do. And Pia Mellody in the resource Breaking Free, the workbook that goes with the Facing Codependence, makes the point in its introduction and says, I wrote this workbook for people that eventually become aware of the overwhelming devastation of what I've just shared with you. That when you tune into that, and your old defenses stop working, the alcoholism and the secondary symptom defenses and the primary symptom defenses, that adult adapted child just can't get you through like it used to, that can be pretty overwhelming. And she makes the point that then recovering people feel more normal in the disease than we do in recovery for probably about the first 18 months. So identifying that, wow, as I start to grow up, turn up and face my reality, I'm not going to feel great immediately. It's going to take some time. It's going to be a little overwhelming. And so the idea there is to then try and normalize that. For anyone that comes into recovery around their addiction issues, we're going to have withdrawal syndrome issues, that for a while our neurochemistry around the reward system of the brain is not going to function like it used to, and it's going to take a while to repair. So with the sort of primary symptom recovery and the secondary symptom recovery, we're really up against it. Why do we do it? Well, we do it because the other alternative is worse. Going back to the gates of hell and walking back in is something people sort of want to avoid. But we have to have real, I think, expectations about early recovery. I found it really heartwarming in a way to realize around Pia Mellody's phrase, we trudge the road to happy destiny, that the exam in life's no picnic, but it is going to be a picnic eventually all the same. That we need to become aware of and appropriately meet our needs of self and others interdependently. And so the addicts, alcoholics are fantastic at meeting their own needs. An alcoholic drinking is meeting a need. It's just not appropriate. It's high consequence. So learning what our needs are and how to meet them. Again, we've got to do a lot of shame reduction work, because however you were shamed about who you were as a person, you might have a shame bind around that need. If you weren't nurtured and physically held, you might have a physical shame bind around physical nurturing. If you were not loved or emotionally connected with another person, when you had emotions, if you were shamed, you might have a shame bind around a particular feeling or being emotional in general. So it can be another thing just to identify what the needs are and then have to do the shame reduction so we can meet those needs. But one thing about recovery, if we can start to esteem from within, learn to protect and contain, learn to identify our reality, accept the imperfections in self and others, become aware of and appropriately meet the needs of self and others, then all of a sudden we sort of get back this ability to be spontaneous and open. We can be present finally. You know, that mightn't sound like much, but, you know, I had another experience of that today with Robbie Abels in this brain spotting session. She asked me to do something interesting at the end of the session. She said, imagine yourself at 5 in my home, with me as the dad, with my boys. Asked me to find a place for him in this home. Would he feel safe here? What would he need here? And it was a really interesting exercise to see that. And it really showed me how I have real clear images of my boys running to me, being held by me, being all over me, just like they're in another appendage, just connected. There was never the safety in my family just for that connection, to meet a spontaneous need for a hug or a kiss, to just gravitate into the proximity of an adult in your family and just have that safety to know that it's okay to be in that orbit. It really gave me a powerful moment, another powerful moment in recovery today, 30 years down the track, and another awareness of, wow, I need to do some ongoing meditations around my inner child. So the journey continues. This was an old model we had, and I've always liked this old slide because it tells the story. It just basically says that childhood trauma causes immaturity. Childhood trauma and immaturity drive unmanageability. Childhood trauma, immaturity and unmanageability create relational problems. And treatment, recovery, intimacy, and reparenting can create a functional adult that can address these problems. This map has in it the problem and the solution, both things really important for recovery. So it fits together with that functional adult. And I suppose I just want to reiterate that point that to achieve this is not easy. So if you have a crack at it, please, by all means, don't give up. Don't quit 5 minutes before the miracle happens, because sometimes if we just continue to put that effort in, we will actually eventually get those promises that A and NA and the other 12-step talks about. That reparenting triangle that comes as a result of Pia Mellody's primary symptoms model is this functional adult is now meant to do that reparenting that we needed as child. The functional adult work, the reparenting. My job now is to deal with, in recovery, that part of the self that was wounded. No one else is coming. It's not anyone's job. It's not my adult parents' job now. Their time has passed. It's not my partner, my sponsor, my husband or wife, my adult children, my best friend. They can assist me, but it's my job. I'll know I'm in that place when I'm age regressive, when I feel a bit young, when I act dependent or childish, but I'll certainly know it if I've got that implicit felt sense of worthlessness. The bit I now have to contain and manage also is that adult adapted child, that part of me that survived, and thank God we grew those survival skills, but it's time now to thrive. So I know whenever I'm attacking myself, criticizing or abandoning or overindulging, that I'm just in that adapted self, and it's time to contain that part of me. And I do that from developing this functional adult that needs to learn to affirm and nurture and have some respectful limits. This journey cannot be done alone. I've not met anyone that can do this journey alone. That functional adult needs lots of support. Peers in recovery, mentors in recovery, sponsors in recovery, some really good professional support, 12-step support where people can reach out and have community around them. I've benefited enormously from having folks that I can call upon to help me get a reality check. In early recovery, as Pia points out in Breaking Free, I actually feel that I'm in recovery when I'm in my adult adapted child, or I can feel in my recovery in my wounded child because it feels normal. Having that person outside of you that can just hear you and reflect back to you where you're at can give you that aha moment to make that adjustment, make that change, get the support you need, and really start to grow that functional adult. The other thing in recovery that I want to reiterate, please, if you didn't watch the last webinar on complex post-traumatic stress, that if you find that this reality model that we use at South Pacific, where data comes in, we run it through our nervous system, we run it through our cognition, our history, learned experience, beliefs, give it a meaning, have a feeling, and choose a behavior. If you get overwhelmed and derailed at times with emotional flashbacks, then you most likely have those complex post-traumatic stress symptoms. That when you have a trigger, you go straight from that central nervous system to that fight, flight, freeze, and what Pete Walker calls fawn, that codependent reaction to try and appease the situation. So please look at that resource from last week, and certainly look up Pia's work on this issue. And as I mentioned, Pete Walker's a big fan of his book, From Surviving to Thriving. Because in our reality, this is the bit that I think it's quite complex when we're in recovery. As I just mentioned, if we've got the polyvagal theory of Stephen Porges, that we'll have that limbic reactivity in recovery, so we need to learn to affect regulate. Insight doesn't help us when we're in that dysregulation. That if we're going to have post-acute withdrawal syndrome, that can be, for that first 18 months of recovery, and we can have physical illness and unwellness in early recovery as a result of the unmanageability and the consequences of addiction. Coming into recovery and trying to manage from the functional adult, that we're going to have those first thought wrong diseases I've heard described. We're going to, under pressure, rush to that adult adapted child, a wounded child. We'll have cognitive distortions, defense mechanisms, core beliefs. Taming that inner critic's important. So at a cognitive level, it's not as easy as it sounds to get into recovery. The feeling level of adult appropriate feelings versus toxic feeling realities, knowing when you're in a toxic feeling reality, knowing how to process and release some of that information. Get that support in early recovery if you can. That the wounded child is based on how we felt when the abuse happened, and we know now that can be that implicit memory, that felt sense, and that won't necessarily be healed with CBT. We, as I experienced this afternoon, brain spotting, radical exposure, trauma-focused yoga, trauma release exercises, somatic expression therapy, going to the body to learn how to affect regulate is essential in dealing with that felt sense. But one of those sayings in recovery is we come to treatment to feel better, but we need to get better at feeling. And changes behavioural, that making those behavioural adjustments. Patrick Carnes makes that point that I really need to get over my reluctance to use the telephone to get support. I need to get over my reluctance to go to a 12-step meeting, get up and share, reach out and get support. So we can't afford to wait to feel better to change our behaviour. We must change our behaviour to get better. And I gave some examples of those things that are on offer. Knowing your trauma type in recovery can be really important, and again, I'm going to steer you back to that webinar I did last month. If you didn't hear it, or you know a friend that might benefit from this, in recovery, it's good to know that what trauma type I experienced. It'll let you know what's your major defense there, and there's some information there about the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and what we're most likely to have as a defense mechanism. The work of Pete Walker, so please look that up, look up that webinar and look up his work. The work of Dr. Dan Siegel, he says if we're going to get in recovery, and as Pia says, these two recoveries, we have to give our brain the optimal chance to get well. At South Pacific Private, they deliver this information in our healthy lifestyles lecture, and it's from Dan Siegel, who came up with the idea from the play on the healthy food platter model of good nutrition in it that they have in America now, to the healthy mind platter for optimal brain matter. So the idea that recovery needs to be to give that functional adult a chance to get well. We absolutely need to have a quite a broad holistic approach to recovery, so our brain gets the chance to learn to regulate and live in its potential, so we can get well. The soothe, contain, move on model is another expression of what I've just shared. the idea, we've got a webinar on this one as well, but it just highlights that when I'm in my wounded child, I really need to just get connected and breathe and really get regulated, and that's not going to be overly insightful, but it's going to be very somatic. And then once I'm back on board and have my executive functioning, I can go through those, doing reality and look for my defense mechanisms. What are my needs? What are the boundaries I need to set? And then to move on again from that functional adult space, how to reparent, radically accept and grow and tune back into what I'm grateful for, really important. Another image that I've always liked from John Bradshaw that we've been able to adapt and use in this recovery map, again, just dealing with those outside syndromes of shame, is what we talk about by saying secondary symptom recovery on its own will not work. Dr. Patrick Carnes mentions that just making first order change doesn't work. We need that second order change to deal with the behavioral cover-ups, to deal with the family system roles, to deal with the primary ego defenses and learn to regulate so we can get in and do that shame reduction around that core of self. And so I hope that when I present this model that it certainly talks about the complex nature, but gives us, a real map of what we need to address in recovery. It sounds like a big order, as they say in AA, and we can't do it all at once. And so easy does it. So we chip away, and it's best done in company. As I said before, I see a lot of people come alive when they get that parasympathetic response from folks when they're nodding their head. I joke a lot about people going to 12-step meetings, and in the 12-step meetings, they start to work these 12 steps, and they see people in the audience sharing and talking and nodding, and they get what they call that Me Too approach. It happens in our Changes program. It happens in primary therapy where people go, wow, I thought I was the only one that felt this way. We did I really enjoyed the 3-part series on the 12 steps that we did. If you're a 12-stepper and you ever want to revisit that, they're on our YouTube page for South Pacific Private. Please revisit that. If you know someone that might like any of these subjects I'm mentioning, please, by all means, steer them towards our YouTube channel. But the 12 steps are a big part of when people need to help with that reparenting role that Pia Mellody outlines. I've put on here because I like people to have it. I'm absolutely not going to go over this. We're near the end of this webinar. But again, I wanted to mention that when it comes to recovery, the Patrick Carnes' 30-point plan and the building the competencies, when I got clean, I knew it was just for today, but I didn't want to go back. I knew there was nothing back there for me. And so I imagine that other people feel that way when they make treatment. They don't want to go back. They want to work at something that at least gives them the best chance of making it from that developmental trauma and addictive and mentally ill life to a life better than they've ever known, the promises of those fellowships. And Carnes' idea, we need to break through denial, understand the nature of the illness, surrender to the process, admit the damage to ourselves and others, establish sobriety, ensure physical integrity, get well, participate in the culture of support, reduce shame, grieve losses, understand that it mightn't just be the one addiction you came in with that you're dealing with, acknowledging the cycles of abuse, bring closure and resolution to addiction shame, restore financial viability, restore meaningful work, create a lifestyle of balance, build supportive personal relationships, establish healthy exercise and nutrition, restore relationship with yourself, resolve original conflict wounds, restore healthy sexuality for those folks with not just sexual issues, but generally it's an intimacy need, involving family members in therapy if we can, alter dysfunctional family relationships, committing to recovery for each family member where possible, resolving the issues with our children, either underage or adult, resolve issues with extended family, working through differentiation, recommitting to primary relationships, commitment to relationships, and then those that idea that we move on in our good intimacy with others and then develop a spiritual life. please, by all means, look up that work of Patrick Carnes. We're very excited to have in August the Certified Sex Addiction Therapist coming out from the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals in the States, headed by Dr. Patrick Carnes. Dr. Stephanie Carnes and Kenneth Adams are coming out. Incredibly talented therapists and medicos in this field, well published, but so please look on our website about the information for that. But essentially, recovery tips: following your aftercare plan, having a recovery plan, continuing to identify and share your reality. I say it regularly at South Pacific: if you're going to take one thing away, journal and do a reality every day. Get to know yourself. Starting to tame your inner critic, as Pete Walker says. Set boundaries, even though it feels worse in recovery to set a boundary than to put a wall up. Practicing mindfulness. I love how these days we support people to have the Take 10 app with them and take it and practice it every day. Prayer and meditation, as they say in the 11th step, it leads us to that spiritual awakening. Affirmations, it's one thing to do shame reduction, but we need to continue to affirm to build that inherent worth. And that functional adult reparenting. And I suppose the other thing that we get from gratitudes is enjoy the beautiful life of recovery, the gift that it is. Some of us never made it. Sometimes in a 12-step meeting they ask for a moment of silence before the serenity prayer. So for the people that are still suffering. Those recovery slogans that give us those in a moment when we're struggling. Let go and let God, turn it over, keep coming back one day at a time, live and let live, expect miracles, to thine own self be true, easy does it. Those things that when we're under stress, sometimes we can't remember chapters in books, but we can remember that one little phrase that just gets us to the next moment of support where we can really sort of take refuge again. And I've always loved, of course, the wonderful mantra that can be the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And South Pacific have added to the end of that the willingness to take action and do whatever it takes. I think I've probably only got about 10 minutes over, maybe more. I've never been able to successfully keep these things to an hour. Thank you for those guys that are sticking in with me. If you want to know more about anything I've mentioned here, please contact the folks at South Pacific. I hope this has been useful. I haven't seen any questions coming through, but by all means, if you want to email us there at South Pacific, Jackie Grant, Sam Higgins will pass on any of those questions. We'll get back to you if we can. I love presenting on this model. It's I am one of those folks that has needed it as a map. I really love the extension. I got to meet Pia Mellody last year. Lorraine and the board sent me over there. It was a wonderful experience. I felt like I was listening. I felt like I was listening to meeting Bruce Springsteen. She was amazing. I particularly loved the last 10 years of John Cash's life and in his music when the producer Rick Rubin came along and looked for the mastery that was in him, not to repeat the glory of his youth, but who was he now as an aging man, as an artist? If you look at the video Hurt by Johnny Cash, you'll see what I mean. Look it up tonight on YouTube. It was a Grammy Award-winning representation of the mastery of eldership. Pia Mellody is in eldership. She is the combined total of a woman, a powerful woman of substance. And she took me through those expanded versions of the model in regards to secondary symptoms and relational issues. And we use that as a training model for staff at South Pacific, and the staff then share that with clients. And so this journey is never ending. And I'll finish on this bit about the model. John Bradshaw called the shaming of a child indirectly or directly a soul murder. That's a powerful phrase. Was he just being dramatic? Pia Mellody says no. She said that when a child in self-centered, self-reflected self-centeredness of youth is disconnected through shame from their own core, It's a soul murder. Why? Because it disconnects them from their creator. We need healthy shame to have a relationship with God if we believe in a spiritual being. Now that disconnection from self and the disconnection therefore to a higher power then shuts us down from that sustenance that people need. For atheist and agnostic, it just cuts us off from ourselves, our higher consciousness, the ability to live in the home which is our own reality. What this model gives us back is the ability to heal those wounds and grow that connection back with ourself. That then, as in the 12 steps it says, as having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. From the two recoveries that this developmental immaturity model gives us access to, and means that we can then have a relationship back with that God of our choosing, God as we understand him. And we can absolutely and certainly, with our connection to self, be connected to others again. And this is what breaks that generational trauma and abuse. And that's the miracle you can expect from this program. So thank you very much for having me tonight. Travel well in your recovery. Please reach out for support if you need it. And I will say farewell to you now. So good night, everyone.